Have you ever noticed the small white crystals that form on your soy wax candles? It's called frosting. If you're a seasoned pro, then you probably know all about it. But if you're just getting into candle making and you're wondering what causes this and what can you do about it, then you're in the right place. In today's episode, we're going to dive all into frosting. I'm going to go over 4 remarkable tips for helping you deal with it like a pro. Hello, my name is Kevin from Armatage Candle Company, the premier resource for accelerating your candle making technique in business online. In today's episode, we're going to talk about frosting, what causes it, if it's harmful, and what you can do about it. So frosting primarily affects soy wax candles. Soy wax comes from soybeans through a process called hydrogenation, after which a few additives are given to the blend to make it a little more candle friendly. But all of this chemistry and all these processes actually come at a little bit of a cost because as a candle wax, soy wax is polymorphic. And that just means that it forms crystals in response to temperature and time. And frosting is a result of those crystal formations. Those crystals also cause things like bumpy tops that we don't like either. But the focus of this is those annoying white crystals that form on the sides of your container candle, typically, sometimes even on the top. Well, today I'm going to give you 4 tips for how you can do your best to mitigate this, but your options are somewhat limited because this is a scientific, natural phenomenon with soy wax. There's not much you can do to prevent it altogether. And in fact, there is a few things you can do to fix it, and I'll talk about why that's really maybe not the best idea, but I'll give you 4 tips to try to prevent the large amount of frosting to happen in the first place. So my first tip today is cure your candles in a stable environment. And this is super important because if you understand the nature of polymorphism, you know that time and changes in temperature are going to lead to more crystal formations. And soy wax is very susceptible to crystal formation, especially after it begins to cool. And so that cure time is really critical, that you can prepare an environment that is very friendly to try to allow that soy wax to behave as properly as possible. So a few recommendations for where you cure your soy candles is try to keep it out of the light and try to keep it in an area where the temperature isn't going to change too much. And you should probably cure for at least a week, if not 2 weeks, before you start to move it from that environment. And we go into a lot more detail about that in another video with curing. But the point is that soy wax does behave erroneously, especially in that first week, 2 weeks after you pour. My second tip today is to document your process. What do I mean? Well, the temperature changes that cause polymorphism or actually trigger crystal formation begin even while you're making the candle. Typically, you heat your wax up to some maximum temperature, and from that point on, it cools down until it finally hardens in a candle. The way that you manage your temperatures when you create candles depends on your processes and what you do. But if you're a soy wax candle maker, if you're incorporating soy wax in your blend, then it's pretty critical that you understand exactly what you're doing with your temperatures to potentially affect or impact the crystal formation. For instance, if you are cooling your candle very, very slowly from the max temperature down to the pour temperature, you may accidentally trigger additional crystal formation because it takes a lot of time and there's a large temperature change in that period of time. So before you even pour, you've given the soy wax a chance to form crystals. But depending on your ambient conditions, you might not experience that at all. I know that a lot of people have had success with pouring and cooling for a very long period of time too, and I've heard people who struggle with a lot of frosting if they do that. And so the point is to build your process and understand exactly how your temperatures and your pour temps and your max temps all impact the frosting. Remember, candles are an entire system. Everything added impacts everything added, and that includes how you manage temperatures. And so document your process to understand things like how much time is passing from the moment that you start to cool that wax to the moment you pour. And you may want to accelerate that time, or you may want to slow it down depending on the results that you get. So if you come out with very limited frosting and you cooled for a long period of time, you'll probably want to do that next time as well. If you cooled for a long time and you got a lot of frosting and bumpy tops as well, then you won't want to do that next time. And I think this is going to be different for every candle maker. There's not a silver bullet with managing your temperatures. It depends on your ambient conditions, your process, your equipment, your supplies, your fragrance oil, your wax, your container, everything. And so the better documentation you have, the better clarity you have into how everything is impacting each other, the better you can come out and eventually build a process that is resilient to frosting. So tip number 3 is a little cheeky, but hide the problem, right? Frosting is unavoidable. Eventually, all soy wax candles will frost to a degree. It's just the natural direction of the wax. But you can hide the problem by doing 2 things. First, use containers that are not see-through. It sounds dumb, but even though the frosting is happening, the container prevents you from really visibly seeing it. And if you can't see it, out of sight, out of mind. The second thing is to use no dye in your color. This may limit because you may have a product line that's built on brilliant colors. If you don't add dye, the natural wax color actually kind of blends in with frosting a little bit. And you can have frosting front and center, but it'll be a little bit harder to see and it won't be as obvious. Frosting is very evident if you have colored candles. If you use strong dyes and there's frosting, it's very clear what's going on there. And that's really the biggest part that candle makers are trying to avoid. The spirit of this tip is just hide the problem altogether. And so the last tip is probably a little less popular, but tip number 4 is to modify your wax. We know that soy wax naturally wants to frost and naturally wants to form these crystals, and it will do so its entire life. But if you can limit the amount of soy and cut it with a different wax like a paraffin, then you can reduce the propensity of that candle to form crystals. Some of you may say, well, soy wax candles are a pillar of my product line, so it's really not an option for you. But if you're making candles for yourself or your friends and you just want good colors and you really don't mind switching or blending, then that may be the right option to try to mitigate the amount of frosting. Okay, so the tips are great, but what if you already have frosting? What do you do? Well, the answer is kind of the universal best tool in candle making ever, and I've got a video about it right here, but a heat gun is the #1 solution for dealing with frosting. Now it comes with a caveat, but first let's talk about how a heat gun can be used, and then I'll talk about why you might not even want to deal with that. Here I am with a heat gun, just running it over the sides. You have to make sure that when you use a heat gun that you melt the very top layer, and then as you heat the sides, kind of lightly over time, it will form what looks like bubbles that rise to the top and escape the candle. And when you're done, the whole candle will appear like it doesn't have any frosting, and it doesn't. But if you think about the root cause of frosting and that these crystals form in response to temperature changes, you've just applied a pretty enormous temperature change to the side of that wax. And so more often than not, when you do apply a heat gun and you fix the frosting at that time, you've actually created a habit and a behavior of the wax to want to create more crystals anyways, and often that frosting will just return. But this is a solution if you need a short-term fix to clean up that candle. And for a period of time, you won't have any frosting at all. Probably the most important part about using a heat gun to take care of frosting, or even worrying about frosting as something you don't want in your candles, is that time is money. And if you're trying to crank out a lot of candles or build a really robust product line, the more time you spend using a heat gun to fix candles, the more time that you're not making other candles. And so it's worth taking a step back and looking at your process and your goals more holistically and deciding is it worth the time it takes to deal with it, even if it's only temporary, just for that one item? And so I'll wrap up with this thought that ties into that. Heat guns often cause more trouble than not. Even when you're just trying to fix other parts of the candle, you may accidentally cause more frosting. And so just consider these two things. First, frosting is merely cosmetic. It doesn't affect the performance of your candle. And so if you're dealing with it because you think it's a problem, you can maybe reconsider it as not as much of a problem. In fact, some candle companies, candle shops will talk about their frosting as a feature of their candle. And even though it's not great, it's relatively unpredictable and random, they can point to the frosting and say, this is how you know this is a soy wax candle. The other big thing, and this may be the biggest thing about frosting, is that the customer usually doesn't care. They usually don't even notice unless you point it out. If you walk down the candle aisle and you look at a lot of those candles, you'll see things like wet spots and bumpy tops and frosting. It's just a normal part of the candle process. And even if you were to control it completely in your setting, in your environment and workshop, the moment that candle leaves your door to travel somewhere else, or it ends up in someone else's home, you've relinquished that control. It's now up to them to keep a stable environment. But they don't care as much as candle makers do, unless they are a candle maker themselves, in which case they'll probably appreciate it. I encourage you not to worry too much about frosting. It's not as much of a problem as it appears, but if you do need to deal with it, use these 4 tips to try to mitigate the frosting that happens in your product line. Real quick before we wrap up, I want to mention one thing. If you're just getting into candle making and you're wondering, how do I test this candle? How do I know if it's right? Well, I've taken the industry standard laid out by ASTM 2417 and I've made a complete template. It's fill in the blank and it's got a few additional criteria and it meets the procedures outlined by the industry standard. I've made it into a PDF that you can just print off. If you want a copy of it, it's free, it's yours. And even if you just get it so that you can make your own copy and build your own template that works better for you, then that's fine too. I just wanted to collect that information and make it really simple to digest that industry standard test. So if you want the PDF, just go to armatagecandlecompany.com/burn test, burn-test. I'll put a link below in the description, but it's only there to add value to your life, even if you just copied it into your own spreadsheet or other tool. So what are you doing to deal with frosting? Is it something that you're sick of? Is it something you don't mind at all? Are you using it to sell your products? Let me know. Otherwise, I hope you have a great week. Like this video if it was helpful to you in any way whatsoever, and I will see you next episode. Bye!